My next two guests are Courtland Cox, one of the co-organizers of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963 and chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee Legacy Project, and Derrick Johnson, president and CEO of the NAACP. I sat down with them recently for the Switch Up podcast. Take a listen. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for joining me today. We are here to talk about the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. So I want to start off. We are 60 years outside of when this march first took place. Talk to me first, Mr. Johnson, about where you think the progress has been since the first march to where we are today.
Well, we've made tremendous progress in the last 60 years, although there's a lot of work still to get done. The path to freedom isn't a straight line. It's a pendulum that swings back and forward. And so because of the many individuals who gathered in 1963, but more importantly, the individuals who worked in local communities across the South, across the Northern territories that prevented equal protection under the law, that's the real deal, because the march is a gathering to highlight what was taking place, but the real work was in communities across the country.
Mr. Cox, I understand you attended the march 60 years ago. Can you tell us what that moment was like? What do you remember?
It's like correction. I was one of the organizers of the march.
One of the organizers.
Yeah, and one of the things that is important is that it's the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So that you had two issues there, both jobs and freedoms. As President Johnson said, on the issue of dealing with the roadblocks of race. Because we were stymied across the board, whether we're talking about education, housing, being in office, political office, we've made tremendous gains in that game. What we have not done is the first part, jobs. And the question of what we're now having is a situation in the Black community, African American community, where in fact, you have a class of people who are billionaires, millionaires, and even thousandaires. Some like me, 100-years. But in fact, there are lots of people who don't have Medicaid. Lots of people who don't have food stamps. There are lots of people who don't have the kind of things that deal with the economic realities that they had to deal with. So as I look at the March on Washington, I think one part of it, in terms of ending the kinds of roadblocks that we had, have been eliminated. But the whole question of jobs really is a lot to be done. I'll stop there. I can talk about the day, but I'll stop there if you have another question.
Yeah, and I wanted to follow up on that because I think when we think about jobs and freedom, what's the connection between the two? How does jobs influence freedom, or freedom influence access to jobs?
Yeah, at the end of the day, the people who define the society, right? The people who define what is accessible and so forth, determine how things go. So my sense is, as we talk about freedom, I think really about politics, the ability to enter institutions and offices that creates various kinds of opportunities on the economic front. So when you look at what's happening in America today, the people who, politics is really about expression of economic interests. That's why people put so much money who are at the top into politics. And the problem is that the people at the bottom don't have the clout in the institutions that will make a difference in terms of their ability not only to access jobs, but to access government services. Mm-hmm. So in Mississippi and a number of places in the South, they've refused to deal with giving people Medicaid, and then, so there is a connection, but you had to get the first one first. You had to have the barriers ended, the political barriers in particular, in order to begin to deal with the economic issues.
This is something I know that the NAACP has been discussing since its inception, is about particularly jobs, about generational wealth has come up, particularly when we talk about access to education. Looking at this moment, we can see that these things haven't been fully addressed. So 60 years later from the original March on Washington, where do we go? Where do we keep pushing, or how do we keep finding new ways to call for this accessibility, this equity, this equality?
So to be clear, the March on Washington 60 years ago was the stopping point between the work, but the work has been going on for centuries. The very reason why Africans were brought here was to exploit them for cheap and or free labor, dominating most of productions. When you look at the movement for human dignity, you're talking about a three-legged stool. Stool one, in a democracy, your vote is your currency. Our access to the ballot box, being able to operate as full citizens. African Americans in this country, we fought in every war. We prevented the breakup of the Union by defeating the Confederacy. No one saved us. We fought for liberation. As a result, we got 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So that first leg of that stool is about access to the ballot box, what Courtland was just talking about, and the vote, and the power of the vote. That second stool was about the aspiration of the future, making sure there was access to a public education system. So if you look at the Southern landscape particularly, the creation of public schools was the result of African Americans getting elected to office in the 1800s, and one of the first policy considerations was the creation of public education across the Southern landscape. And then the third leg is the ability to negotiate for one's labor and skill, whether individually or collectively. That's the three-legged stool of the movement in this country for black people, and it's been going on for centuries, not just 60 years. The March on Washington was a culmination of many individuals and leaders coming together. It was intergenerational, so you had the senior leaders like A. Philip Randolph, you had individuals in between age like Vi Rushes, and you had Courtland and his counterparts of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee members who all came together to highlight that this country had not fulfilled its commitment as guaranteed in the Constitution. So 60 years was a stopping point, but the fight will continue to go on as it had gone on prior to the March on Washington. There is no community more American than Black Americans. Despite all of the reneging of the promise, we still hold true to making democracy work is one of our primary responsibilities, and to ensure equal protection under the law. The beautiful thing about Courtland and the SNCC veterans, they focus narrowly on how do we empower more young people. You know, it's fascinating. He talked about the experience once he turned 30, he realized he was old. And that's how he treats the movement. Once a young person who's active, once they turn 30, he's looking for the next group of individuals, because we have to keep the pipeline of young activists to understand that they have a voice and a vote, and that they're owners of government, and they should never be victims of government.
I think about a lot of what we're seeing right now politically, both at the federal level, at the state level, when it comes to voting rights and attempts to suppress particularly Black voters. I think about some of the decisions, as you mentioned, that we've seen come down from the Supreme Court, but even decisions, for instance, on limiting what parts of Black history can be taught in schools. How does this affect this type of conversation when we're talking about bringing up the next leaders, when we talk about continuing to push forward with this movement? How do these moments affect that ability to do those things?
Well, it just rekindles the concept, what Courtland said earlier, that we are in the fight. We are in the fight to ensure that individuals are not put in office who run counter to what the future of this country should be, because they're trying to move us back to 1950s reality. You know, you think about the March on Washington, three things important came out of that. You had a group of individuals who went to the march, and they left, and they doubled down their dedications, and they went to a state like Mississippi. Courtland was one of those people, and they created a real strategy, because they realized, although the march was important, significant, and it felt good for some, but the people are going to go back and live in the same hell they left from. Right? And out of that, you get Freedom Summer. Out of that, you get the challenge to the Democratic Party and the notion of who will have access to the vote. But also out of that was the free speech movement and the women's suffrage movement. All of these things came out of it because it was a true demonstration that we individually have agency to give rise to what was necessary. And because of Freedom Summer, you get the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Because of Freedom Summer, you have the concept of community health centers all across the country now. Because of Freedom Summer, we recognize that the movement must be community-centric, not egocentric. It's never about the one person or the one speech. It's about the collective whole, putting in the work to ensure that equal protection under the law is afforded to everyone.
Mr. Johnson, you said something I want to come back to about it's not about the specific individual or a specific speech. And I know at the March on Washington, the part that everybody talks about, that we all learn about in school, is that was the moment we heard Dr. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. But what else, and Mr. Cox, perhaps you want to address this, what else about that march or even about that specific speech do we overlook so often when we talk about that moment?
The speech I remember most is John Lewis's speech. Because when there were 250,000 people out there, John Lewis, Jim Foreman, myself, had to change John's speech because the Kennedy administration opposed his speech, because he was critical of the Kennedy administration. And one of the things about the speech in 1963 was he called for one person, one vote, which was a radical concept. But when I listened to King's speech, and there were all things going on there. I mean, when I was up on the stage, Marlon Brando was up there, and James Baldwin, and Charlton Heston, and every movie star you can think of, Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier. So it was hard for me to do both John's speech and look at all this going on, and listen to Mahalia Jackson talk about, egging King on, tell him, Rev, tell him. And so there were a lot of things. But when I looked at the speech after, because I really couldn't understand it while all these things were going on, I think King answered the question that most white Americans were saying. And every time we did something, they would say, "What do you Negroes want?" And King said, "We have a dream that's deeply rooted in the American dream."
And in the speech, we focus on the dream, and the true essence of the speech is there's a promissory note called the Constitution, and we took it to the steps of justice, and it came back insufficient funds. That the very promise of this nation to its citizens, and we are human, we are citizens, are coming back to us insufficient funds. That's the fight we're in today. That's the fight that we must protect and continue moving into the future. Because at the end of the day, the march symbolized an intersecting point of local people and many others who were local leaders coming together, agreeing that this nation must recognize African Americans as Americans, and that we were entitled to all of the promises of the Constitution. That's the significance of the moment. It was the stopping point between the work, because people left there and they continued the work.
Let me just point one other point about the march. The march was organized in less than 90 days. Yes, wow. Less than 90 days. Brought 200,000 people here. The morning when I got up and I was walking the mall with Bayard Rustin, and we saw nobody. And Bayard turns around and said, what do we have here? And the problem was there were so many people coming in at the same time, the highways were clogged up. Nobody could get into town. And all of a sudden, all thousands and thousands, but less than 90 days. And the reason we were able to do it in less than 90 days, I think, was the work of the NAACP and the kind of magnet it was, because in the 50s, it was a criminal act to have an NAACP card in Mississippi. And black people, that subterfuge, all that energy was there. So you were able to bring that energy together in 90 days. It took less than 90 days to put that march together.
It's incredible, absolutely incredible. Talk to me a little bit about what that organizing was like, because I'm trying to imagine in my brain, because as you mentioned, it wasn't just one person. You got Sidney Poitier up there with y'all. You got John Lewis.
Look, you have, so the key, and you had all the politics. A lot of people have, and Derrick mentioned this earlier. A. Philip Randolph was, I mean, his name is not mentioned now when people, but he was a towering figure. He was, he towered over everybody because he had the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And that it was his dream that they wanted to do the first march in 1941, and, to end segregation in the military. And then he was, Randolph was, they did the executive order desegregating the military, so that march did not happen. So it was 20 years later that this happened. And you've got not only that, it was a coalition. You had the NAACP, the Urban League, SCLC, SNCC, and CORE, in terms of civil rights, but then you had the Catholic Church, then you had the Jewish community, and then you had the Christian people. The only big thing that was missing, there were no women organizations, they were all kind of men kind of thing. And so you had people and labor was very big. So you had a group of people who could come together quickly. But then the question of transportation was huge. I mean, we had to, because it was very difficult to get the transportation, because one of the things I had to do was bring people from the South. And I had a big idea of having a freedom train. And, because traveling in the South was very difficult at that time. So I figured if they were all in one place on a train, it would be easier. But we couldn't get there. The railroad people didn't want to do it. And so we had to hire buses. But people, they came in school buses. They came in, they came in car. They just took because it's very dangerous traveling on the roads in the South. So, you had literally an explosion of people saying, and to quote Fannie Lou Hamer, people being sick and tired of being sick and tired. That was the energy that brought people to the march in less than 90 days. They were sick and tired of being sick and tired.
Was there a moment at all during the day when you're there, when you're up on stage? Because as you mentioned, it wasn't safe for some of these people to come up, but were you worried actually at the march, standing there in the shadow of the memorial? Was there any concern then?
We were so far up. I was up on the stage in Lincoln Memorial, so it was hard for me to interact with and see people. One of the things that happened is, and I'm sure people were embarrassed, that people were so energized. It was supposed to be the leadership, holding hands and and being in front of the march. People started marching without the leadership, so they had to run and catch up with them. Because people were just, hey, we're here to make our statement. And this is not about leaders, not because King called us, it's not because, Roy Wilkins called us, not because, Jim Farmer called us or anybody. We're just sick and tired of being sick and tired.
And I know we're running close on our time, but I wanted to ask, because I know August 26th, there's going to be another march here in D.C. that's acknowledging, commemorating, continuing the march from 60 years ago. But as we've talked about today, it's more than just marching. It's more than just hitting the streets and putting our signs in the air. Where do you want to see? I know we have an election coming up, 2024, which for some folks feels far away, but for a lot of us, it's tomorrow. It's right around the corner. Where do you want to see young folks putting their time and energy into outside of marches like what we're going to see on the 26th?
Go ahead.
For the NAACP, everything we're doing is in preparation for November 2024. Everything. Because that election would define the future of America in ways in which no other election has defined the future. Who sits in the White House will determine if we're going to be a country looking forward, embracing the diverse population that we have grown to become, or will we have someone sitting in that seat seeking to make us a 1950 reality, which is impossible to do, which will cause harm to far too many communities. For young people, them understanding what that truly means to their future. For young African-American kids, for young people, it would either allow you to advance a future that's consistent with what your interests are and your talents develop to be, or it would limit your possibilities. That's what's at stake. November 2024 is not a long way away. It is right around the corner, and for young people, we must engage because that election will determine the future of this country and the opportunities for young people in our community.
I think that there's quite a few people, both black, brown, white, who will say, well, there's nothing left to fight for. We had a black president, we're good, right? Like, we hear that a lot. Oh, you guys had Obama, aren't you fine now? Aren't you happy? Oh, you have Kamala Harris, you have Ketanji Brown Jackson. They can name these names. Mm-hmm. How do we tell folks the fight isn't over? There's still more left to do.
For many people, they just look at their surroundings. Until we close the disparity gaps, the dealing with income, education, opportunity, there's more to fight for. You know, when you think about that three-legged stool I talked about earlier, access to voting is the paramount. We have many states and governors who are trying to limit access to voting for African Americans and other communities. When you think about that second leg, quality education for all children, you have far too many young people being born in zip codes that would permanently lock them out of the exposure of a quality education. And the ability to negotiate for one's skill, labor, individually or collectively, we are seeing strikes bubble up, whether it's the writer's guild or the actors or many others, because people are not being paid their fair wage. Now you have the billionaire class making tons of money, and yet you have far too many individuals who are hard-pressed to make a livable wage. That's what the reality is, and that's what the fight is about. Those three legs, and everything else germinate from there.
Yeah, and I would remind people the March in Washington was for jobs and freedom. And one of the things that even though a number of the racial barriers are gone, we see even outside our community, UPS people talking about, you know, the wages and the relationship. You're talking about American Airlines. I know people in Delta Airlines. You know, we're talking about the Screenwriters Guild. So the question, the economic question, is the fundamental question. And to me, the question of who gets involved and who shares is something that is really going to, as was said, ongoing. And we not only see it in our communities, we see it across America. Because as we now say, we have billionaires who think that America is their plaything, and the Supreme Court is their plaything, and so forth. So therefore, we need to understand that those of us who are not in that class, and those of us who have to live in America, have to be the people who are going to make the difference.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Mr. Derrick Johnson, CEO and President of the NAACP, and Mr. Courtland Cox, Chairperson of the SNCC Legacy Project, thank you both so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.